On a peaceful snowy afternoon in February, Elizabeth Anderson sat quietly knitting in her living room. The unused pale pink yarn danced gently on her swollen belly. With just a week until her due date, she was nearly finished with the tiny socks she was making for her long-awaited child. Their 5-year-old two-story house stood out even among the upscale Minneapolis suburbs. White exterior walls with deep green shutters, and a meticulously maintained front yard. Everything looked perfect, a world Elizabeth could never have imagined during her days working as a nurse. "Beth, knitting again. Don't you have enough baby clothes already?" At the sudden voice, Elizabeth stopped her hands. Turning around, she saw her mother-in-law Victoria standing there with a homemade apple pie. Their tradition of sharing dinner 3 times a week had continued since they moved into this house 5 years ago. "Hello, Mother. But I still think we need more." Elizabeth smiled gently. Her mother-in-law was a powerful figure in local society circles, known by everyone who mattered. On the surface, she doted on her daughter-in-law and had even provided the down payment for the house. All neighborhood connections had been established through her, and weekend tea parties and charity events had somehow become obligations. Elizabeth often found herself privately uncomfortable with Victoria's occasionally overbearing attitude. "James is working late again today?" Victoria asked while looking out the window. Her son, a department head at a major life insurance company, was an elite earner making over $300,000 a year. Though he was known in the neighborhood as an ideal husband, work had been keeping him late recently. Especially in the past 3 months, he'd been coming home late 3 nights a week, supposedly training new employees. "Yes, seems like a new project has started," Elizabeth answered vaguely. She had finally become pregnant 2 years ago after fertility treatments. As a former pediatric nurse, she understood the preciousness of life better than anyone. Her caring nature and family-first attitude had earned her the trust of those around her. However, an unspoken anxiety was growing in her heart. Her husband's recent behavior seemed somehow unsettled. Suspicious late-night phone calls. The way he hastily closed his laptop screen. And last week, the handkerchief she found by chance, carrying an unfamiliar perfume scent. Still, Elizabeth shook her head to dismiss her doubts. Perhaps she was just being oversensitive since becoming pregnant. On the living room shelf sat their wedding photo. The smiling faces of the young couple from 5 years ago. Elizabeth beaming happily in James's arms. Next to it was a family photo from last Christmas, showing the 3 of them together with Victoria. Everything looked perfect. Yes, perhaps it only looked that way. "The baby will surely be a beautiful girl," Victoria said, as if changing the subject. Outside the window, the snow was falling more heavily. The harsh winter in the Minneapolis suburbs seemed far from over. The morning sun streamed into the maternity ward at Mayo Clinic. The view from the hospital room window was a world of silver white. The snow that had started falling last night was still quietly continuing. Minnesota winter was still in full force. Elizabeth lay in bed, cradling her newborn daughter Grace. A tiny 6-pound life. 3 days had passed since the C-section delivery, and she had finally been cleared for discharge this morning. Both mother and child were progressing well. "Good morning, Grace." The baby, wrapped in soft infant clothes, was sleeping while moving her tiny lips. Though the birth came a week earlier than expected, thankfully there were no major issues. Elizabeth's heart swelled with warmth at the prospect of their new life together. 7 a.m. The room door was knocked, and Sarah, the attending nurse, entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson. Are you ready for discharge?" "Yes, almost everything's packed. Just about 30 minutes until my husband comes to pick us up." At that moment, there was some commotion in the hallway. Sarah frowned briefly and walked to the window. Looking down at the parking lot, her expression tensed. Mrs. Anderson. Could you wait a moment?" "Something." Sarah's words trailed off. Elizabeth felt anxious and tried to approach the window herself, but Sarah hurriedly raised her hand to stop her. "Please wait here while I check." After the nurse left the room, the noise in the hallway increased. Voices of other patients and nurses. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens. 10 minutes later, the room door opened again. This time it was Dr. Carter, her attending physician. The usually calm doctor wore an unusually serious expression. "Mrs. Anderson, could we have a bit more time before proceeding with your discharge? Has something happened?" "Don't worry. It's just that the police." The doctor's words were drowned out by a sudden commotion in the hallway. Elizabeth quietly stood up, still holding her baby. "Did something happen to my car?" Dr. Carter didn't answer. Instead, he let out a deep sigh. "The police officers will be here to talk." At that moment, the room door burst open. 2 detectives entered. One was a gray-haired man in his 50s, the other a female detective in her early 30s. Both wore stern expressions. "Mrs. Anderson, we need to speak with you." The gray-haired detective showed his police badge. "Detective Murphy, Minneapolis Police Homicide Division." The moment she saw that title, Elizabeth's body began to tremble slightly. "We'll have a nurse take care of the baby." The female detective spoke gently but firmly. Elizabeth handed Grace to the nurse, lacking the strength to resist. "Now, let's go to the parking lot." No one spoke during the elevator ride. The first-floor lobby they emerged into was more crowded than usual. Hospital staff, police officers, and what appeared to be several reporters. All eyes were on Elizabeth. As the automatic doors opened, the freezing wind stung her cheeks. Elizabeth turned up the collar of her thin coat. Several patrol cars were parked in the lot. And in one cordoned-off area marked with yellow tape was her car. Red emergency lights cast an ominous glow on the pure white snow. The driver's side window was completely shattered. And around the car stood 6 uniformed officers. All of them watching her. "Ma'am, please stay away from the vehicle." One officer called out, but Elizabeth's feet were already moving toward the car. "Why, what happened to my..." Her words trailed off. The trunk was open, and from it came a foul odor. The young female detective quickly grabbed her arm. "Mrs. Anderson, please don't come any closer." But it was too late. Elizabeth had already seen what was in the trunk. A black plastic bag. Reddish-brown stains diluted by melting snow. And just visible from the bag, a human hand. She couldn't even scream. All strength left her body. Just before losing consciousness, one memory flashed through Elizabeth's mind. 3 nights ago. The sound of the trunk closing when her husband came home. And after his shower, that unfamiliar perfume scent. In the Minneapolis Police Headquarters interrogation room, Elizabeth clutched a paper cup of coffee with both hands. The coffee, which should have been warm, had gone cold. "Let me confirm once again." Detective Murphy pointed to a photograph spread on the desk. It showed a woman's body half visible from a black plastic bag. "Do you know this person?" "Amy Mitchell. A new employee at your husband's company." Elizabeth shook her head. However, there was already uncertainty in her gesture. Yes, she felt like she had seen her somewhere before. Detective Morris played surveillance camera footage. Mayo Clinic parking lot. The screen showed Elizabeth's car. And a figure moving around the car. "At this time, you should have been asleep in your hospital room." "So why was your car?" "I don't know." Elizabeth's voice trembled. The hospital's entry and exit records provided her with a perfect alibi. It was physically impossible for her to have left her room late at night after a C-section. "Then what do you make of this?" Murphy presented a printout. A threatening email received by Amy Mitchell's account. The sender was listed as Elizabeth Anderson. "Stay away from my husband. Or else." "That's not true. I never sent such an email." At Elizabeth's denial, the detectives exchanged silent glances. Outside the interrogation room, technical investigators were analyzing data from her smartphone. Then, at 10:30 a.m., everything changed. "Mrs. Anderson, thank you for your patience." A new detective entered with a USB drive. It had been found in Amy's apartment. "We found some interesting records on this USB." The screen displayed accounting records. James Anderson's name. Multiple secret accounts. And a staggering amount of debt. $5 million. Seeing that number triggered various memories in Elizabeth's mind. Her husband's late-night absences. Disappearing bank balances. And the life insurance policies that had suddenly increased recently. Everything was connected. But not in the way she had hoped. "Mrs. Anderson, do you know your husband's whereabouts?" It took several seconds to understand the question's meaning. James Anderson. He was supposed to pick up his wife from the hospital this morning. But he hadn't shown up. The company couldn't reach him either. The digital forensics results are in. A technical investigator brought in a new report. The threatening email's IP address. Email client settings. Everything had been cleverly disguised. However, the data pointed to one fact. These emails were sent from your home. The air in the interrogation room felt heavy. Outside the window, snow had started falling again. Detective Morris rushed in. In her hand was a medical record. Amy Mitchell's last hospital visit. 6 months pregnant. The father's name wasn't listed, but witness testimonies all pointed in one direction. Murphy let out a deep sigh. To be frank, we believe your husband and she were having an affair. And that relationship had broken down. Amy was threatening to go public with everything. Meanwhile, your husband had substantial debt. Elizabeth's vision swayed. Like a nightmare. But this was undeniably real. Mrs. Anderson, how do you explain this? Placed on the desk was an insurance policy. The beneficiary had been recently changed. From Elizabeth Anderson to Victoria Anderson. At that moment, the interrogation room door burst open. A young officer rushed in. Victoria Anderson. She had come to the police voluntarily with information. Elizabeth's mother-in-law had noticed her son's changes. Heavy gambling losses at casinos. Illegal fundraising. And relationships with multiple women. She had known everything but kept silent. However, now that silence was about to end. Detective Morris presented new evidence. Hidden camera footage found in Amy's apartment. James Anderson's figure. Planning what was meant to be a perfect crime. Just then, an officer burst in. James Anderson has been spotted at the airport. The atmosphere in the interrogation room changed instantly. And at that moment, all the gears began turning. Toward the truth. Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. Amid flying radio communications, airport police and the investigation team began moving quickly. A few passengers stood anxiously in the late-night terminal. And on a bench in front of the boarding gate sat a man. James Anderson had planned to board a flight to Dubai. His passport was forged. He carried $500,000 in cash. It seemed like a perfect escape plan. However, he had failed to account for one thing. The police had set up one final trap with Victoria's cooperation. "Mother, why?" James's expression contorted. The words that escaped his mouth at the moment of arrest hinted at the whole truth. At the same time, at Mayo Clinic, Elizabeth stood in front of the nursery, watching Grace's sleeping face. Nurse Sarah gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Babies need their mother's love." Those words slowly began to thaw her frozen heart. In the police headquarters interrogation room, James began his confession. The detectives were stunned by his shocking admission. It all began 2 years ago. Heavy gambling losses at casinos. Embezzlement. And then meeting Amy, the new employee. Affairs were routine for him. But Amy was different. She was carrying my child. A 6-month-old fetus. This coincided with the time Elizabeth was struggling with fertility treatments. The insurance fraud was planned from the beginning. Multiple life insurance policies. Changing the beneficiary. Everything was part of a plan to erase the $5 million debt. And there was another accomplice in this plan. Amy herself was an accomplice. A shocking truth revealed. Amy and James had agreed to split the insurance money. The fabricated threatening emails. Evidence carefully prepared to cast suspicion on Elizabeth. But the plan went wrong. Amy tried to break our agreement. As her pregnancy progressed, Amy's attitude changed. She began threatening to reveal everything. And demanded more money. They had their final discussion in the Mayo Clinic parking lot. She said she would ruin my life. The struggle quickly spiraled out of control. The scarf around Amy's neck. Too much force applied in an instant. And then I panicked. To dispose of the evidence, he used Elizabeth's car trunk. The hospital parking lot should have provided his wife with a perfect alibi. However, he had overlooked one thing. Mike Johnson, the hospital janitor. He had witnessed all the suspicious activity late at night. And the glove found in the camera's blind spot became crucial evidence. New evidence continued to emerge. The hidden camera found in Amy's apartment. She had installed it herself. All conversations, all plans were recorded. And among them was unexpected footage. In the footage, James was already involved with Amy. 5 years ago, behind the scenes while a happy bride smiled in her white wedding dress. Victoria Anderson's testimony was even more shocking. I knew everything. Her son's broken life. Multiple affairs. Debts. She had known it all and kept silent. Because I too was an accomplice. She had been involved in the insurance fraud plan. The change of beneficiary was proof. However, murder was not part of the plan. Later, in a room at Mayo Clinic, Elizabeth cradled her newborn daughter. I'm sorry, Grace. Tears rolled down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of despair. They were tears for a new beginning, after knowing and accepting everything. The following year, Elizabeth Anderson bustled about in her white coat in Mayo Clinic's pediatric ward. She had returned to nursing 6 months ago. The hospital where she had given birth. The place where everything had changed. Now, she was walking a new path in life. Dr. Anderson, happy first birthday. Elizabeth smiled gently at her colleague's voice. Today was Grace's first birthday. She planned to pick her up from daycare after her shift. Thank you. Today is a special day. It meant more than just a birthday. Today, at the Hennepin County Courthouse, James Anderson's sentence would be handed down. The sentence was read solemnly. The courtroom was filled with people connected to the case. In the front row sat Amy Mitchell's parents. A year ago, they had been overwhelmed with grief and anger. But now, their expressions showed a kind of resignation. We want to do what we can for Amy. Mrs. Mitchell spoke about the scholarship fund they had established last year. It was meant to support female students facing financial hardship. Though their daughter's life was lost, they were determined not to let the tragedy be in vain. In the back seat sat Victoria Anderson. Though charged as an accomplice, she received a suspended sentence in consideration of her full cooperation with the investigation. "I will spend my life making amends." Having completely withdrawn from society circles, she now volunteers supporting domestic violence victims. She was also allowed to look after Grace on weekends. "My mother-in-law has truly changed," Elizabeth spoke quietly. Over the past year, she had learned that hatred produces nothing. After the sentencing, Elizabeth headed to her new home. She had moved from the previous mansion and now lived in a small house. But this house was filled with warm light. Grace, picked up from daycare, ran to her with a smile. Her steps were remarkably steady for a 1-year-old. Even the doctors were amazed at her growth. "Happy birthday, my angel." In the living room, a homemade cake was ready. Candlelight gently illuminated the room. Around the cake gathered a new family. Elizabeth's parents, and surprisingly, Amy's parents had been invited too. "We've agreed to be Grace's honorary grandparents," Mrs. Mitchell explained. To break the chain of hatred, the two families had chosen the path of reconciliation. "And this is our new project." Elizabeth pulled out a brochure. "Breaking the Silence, a new organization supporting victims of domestic violence and financial abuse." She had decided to use her experience to help others in similar situations. "Our activities are already receiving significant response." The insurance industry had tightened its contract review standards in response to this case. DV hotlines were also made mandatory. The media, too, had shifted from sensational reporting to examining the core issues. At night, after putting Grace to bed, Elizabeth continued working in her home office. Various photographs adorned the walls. Christmas parties at the hospital. Support group members. And photos documenting Grace's growth. Her life was definitely moving forward. On her desk lay a diary. "Dear Grace." It contained all the truth. Because someday, when her daughter grows up, there will be a day when she wants to know about this incident. But now was not yet that time. Outside the window, snow had begun falling again. But this winter was different from last year. Even in the freezing cold, there was a definite hint of spring. Elizabeth picked up a photograph from her desk. Her and Grace right after birth. A snapshot taken just before everything changed that morning. "We're going to be all right," she whispered, smiling quietly. Tomorrow would begin another new day. And each day was filled with new hope. The clock showed 11 p.m. Grace's breathing could be heard from the next room. Elizabeth added one final line to her diary. "To my beloved daughter. Life sometimes confronts us with cruel truths. But if you have the courage to face those truths and overcome them, a new path will surely open. You are that hope itself." The snow that had piled up in the Mayo Clinic parking lot had now completely melted. There stood families celebrating the birth of new life. Truth sometimes appears before us in its most cruel form. However, The courage to accept that truth and keep walking forward becomes the power to carve out a new life. Elizabeth Anderson's story was proof of such hope.